Well, I would like to thank Holly and the Mercer County Historical Society for having me again today. This is always a privilege and an honor to come up here and get to speak on a historical event, or just history as a whole, because in my opinion it is so very important. What we're going to be going over today in reference to the 136th year anniversary of the Johnstown Flood. Now, the Johnstown Flood always fascinated me because it was Pennsylvania history, and I've always been taken in by Pennsylvania history. And so I never studied it thoroughly, though, until my brother and I, we had wrote a spec script called The Forks on George Washington and his adventure up here into northwest Pennsylvania. And then when we finished that, we were looking for a second project, and this was something we had talked about. So I began the research on it. And I'm so glad I did. I'm so glad this was a topic we dove into, because it is fascinating. It is tragic. It is sad. It evokes emotion, both sadness again and pain and those things. But at the same time, there are some great human nature stories that came out of it. There is also several local ties. I'll be touching on one couple that was there during the flood. And then also, just as a country, as a people, how people were brought together. But it also dives into, and this is what makes it a great story, it dives into these different ideas. Greed, separation of wealth, not paying attention, not bringing in the right people, not doing a project correctly. And to the point of, again, it causing great tragedy, because some people looked at things like this and other people knew that it had to be done differently. And now we'll be talking about the South Fork Dam. The South Fork Dam, dammed in Lake Conemaugh, just 14 miles east of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. What we have here is the Conemaugh Valley, and hopefully everyone can see this okay. I know some of you over here, so I'll try to explain it, describe it the best I can. But this is a map of the Conemaugh Valley down in Johnstown. And so what you had was the South Fork Dam, which backed up what was called the Western Reservoir, eventually the South Fork, the Lake Conemaugh, but it was part of the canal system. Pennsylvania was building a canal system in the 1830s and 40s, following the building of the Erie Canal up in New York. The Erie Extension Canal, which ran right through here, was going on at that time. But they were trying to cross the Appalachian Mountains. From Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, they were building a canal system, because we know in this country, one thing America is extremely good at is infrastructure. It is what separates it from many, many other places in the world, and that is infrastructure. That's transportation, that is sanitation, that is these medical, different things like that, that allow this country to prosper like it has. And at this time, it was canal systems. So now you had to figure out how to get over the Appalachian Mountains with a boat. So they built these series of reservoirs, and then they would raise the water that went along with the lock systems that we've seen, that then could get these boats to transport goods over the mountains. So now you could connect Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And then Pittsburgh was now being connected to the Great Lakes. So now that means it can be connected to New York City. So you can move product much quicker. So that was the main focus of why this reservoir and this dam was built originally. I believe 1853 is when it was completed by the state of Pennsylvania. And then what it did was it held back the water from the Conemaugh River, which eventually would go down, and it would pass South Fork, a small town. It would pass Mineral Point, another small town where the Conemaugh Viaduct will eventually be built. It goes down through Woodvale, East Conemaugh, and into the growing city of Johnstown. Now, when Johnstown was first built, there were some iron furnaces, there was some people settling, because it was a confluence of two creeks. So it made it a very good place to settle, build mills, grist mills, things like that. So that became a popular spot. As the canal system began to flourish there again, that grew. But eventually, in the 1850s, we know, railroads took over. Railroads became the main form of transportation in the country. They were the biggest companies in the country: the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. You know, these were companies that were massive, and they were building these railroads. That changed the game for canals. Canals became obsolete, And what you had then with the Western Reservoir is it just really didn't happen anymore. It wasn't as important as it was before and just became a lake. It was sold to the Pennsylvania Railroad because they were the ones that bought up all the property coming through, because that's where they'd be laying their tracks. So now the Pennsylvania Railroad, even though it was one of the largest companies in the country, one of the most powerful and tied to some of the most powerful men in the country, Tom Scott, Andrew Carnegie got his start at the Pennsylvania, Robert Pitcairn, all these gentlemen that were becoming the wealthiest men in the world because of this infrastructure, do nothing with the dam. Do nothing with it. But let's first talk about Johnstown as a whole, and we'll get back to the dam as we move along. Johnstown sat in a valley surrounded by mountains, which made it a beautiful place geographically. Now, I had a history professor in college who, the first thing we talked about on day one of history of Pennsylvania was geography. He had a map of the state up on the board, drawn with chalk. So that tells you when that was. And it had lines for rivers. It had some mountain type designs on it. But he said the key to history is geography. You must first understand geography and topography in order to understand the events that stem from that. Because what I also believe, and I believe many others believe, is trends change, technology changes, clothing changes, human nature remains the same. And it always will. The good, the bad, and everything in between. And that's what we're going to see as we talk more about this. Human nature. So again, we can say, oh, the Johnstown Flood, that happened in 1889. All they had was different clothes. All there was dirt roads instead of paved roads. Railroads were big industry, just like the internet of today. It was the major industry of the country. So you have this booming town sitting in this valley, this beautiful valley in which many people believe made a great vacation spot, especially for those coming from Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh being only 50 miles to the west, if even, very close. And now the Pennsylvania Railroad, as it connected to Pittsburgh, it went right through Johnstown. Baltimore and Ohio went right through Johnstown as well. So you have this major railroad hub in Johnstown. And out of that, of course, what railroads need? They need track. So they need timber, they need steel, they need iron, they need all these things. So that became the industry of the day. And what had happened in Johnstown, and again, we always have to remember, what we do today will affect tomorrow. Everything has a ripple effect. Every tree we cut down will affect something. And that's what was happening. They had clear-cut the hillsides. Clear-cut the hillsides. So many of them, the soil was so loose, because of course it's the trees and the grass and the ferns that keep it all tight and together. Now it's all loose, it's all open. Then you have the rivers themselves going by what was the Cambria Iron Works. The Cambria Iron Works, owned by Tom Morrell, was the biggest company in the city of Johnstown. They made steel, they made iron, and then they made barbed wire, which was another big industry for fencing and cattle. Farmers were beginning to use barbed wire and things like that. So what you have are these major industries. So what do you do with steel, the runoff of steel that you can't use? Well, you pour it into the river. And what does it do when it hits the water? Solidifies. Now you basically have landfill. So now you have rivers that are cut in half of the size they originally were, because now they are filled with steel. So now they're filled with these different products. And then you have no way to catch rain as it happened on the hillsides, because they were clear cut. But we had to build rails. We had to build track. So it's always that question of balance, But in this situation, it became a recipe for disaster. And it did not help. Now the people of Johnstown, were right here. They were iron workers in plants like this, in Cambria Iron Works. They would go to the opera. Obviously they played a lot of billiards. I found several pictures of billiards hall. And they were of all different occupations. Pharmacist, which they called druggist at the time. There was people who owned stores of every different sort. There was different miners. There was a lot of mining going on at the time. There was hotel owners and operators. There was maids. There were servants. So there was people doing every occupation you can think of in a booming town. So of course you had a lot of builders as well, a lot of carpenters and that. So you had this booming town because of this new industry. You had a lot of immigrants, Hungarian immigrants, German immigrants, Slovak immigrants that were coming into the area. They needed housing. If you look at old census records, I remember seeing it on my great-grandfather's census record in Lower Hill District of Pittsburgh, 1901 or 1900 census. You had a lodger, is what they call it. It was a 42-year-old man, most likely he worked with them, that lived with them. A single immigrant or a single man that came in, didn't have a wife yet, so really wasn't able to kind of take care of himself to an extent, so they took him in. And that was a very, very common thing back then. You'll see that in several different places on census records. I had a buddy from Russia we took in for several years, so technically he would have been a lodger as well. We probably should have made him pay more rent, but that's another story altogether. But anyway, but so that was a common practice. So this was the layout of the town, and hotels were also used as apartments, and even like what you call modern day condos, where you would stay in a hotel for months and months at a time, or however long, while you were finding other housing. So that was Johnstown itself. Now Johnstown was used to floods because of its location. I mean, it was in a valley, surrounded by hills, surrounded by water. So it was used to flooding. But you had floods, 2-3 feet of water. People were so used to it, they knew how to react to it, and it came slow. It was that slow rising in rivers. So you could adjust to the floods. And don't get me wrong, they had destroyed, they had broken, they had caused a lot of damage, but people could handle it. People were ready for those. But what we have here, and I have several pictures up here. John O'Reilly, who was the man who bought the dam off of the Pennsylvania Railroad. I have 2 pictures of Pymatooning. Now, that was my front yard growing up. I was very fortunate. I lived right next to Pymatooning, so I was at this gatehouse and at this dam all the time as a young man. My father was the last non-working maintenance manager in the state of Pennsylvania up at Pymatooning. When he retired, they changed the classification, and last man to wear a uniform in that position. So Pymatooning was our home, but it's also a great example of a well-built dam. Now this dam was built in 1933, and what we're going to look at when we see the comparison of the 2 dams is the gatehouse itself is this. This is the tower that has the controls, where you could go in there, and at this time you turned the big wheel to open up the valves to go to discharge pipes. Now the discharge pipes here for Pymatooning are down below. And then the fill, of course, was layers of earth, broken slate, large rocks. It advanced, of course, in the 1930s when Pymatooning was built to a little more sturdiness, but at the same time, very similar in design, and that's what the dam was supposed to be. So in 1862, while O'Reilly had it, there was a breach because it hadn't been used in a while. Things were getting a little rusty, the water was flowing, the spillway had kind of given a little bit to just lack of maintenance. So there was a breach in 1862, but what it did is it more shot out kind of the front, like a water balloon that got poked. So it just kind of spurted out water. So again, it flooded Johnstown, but it did it in this slow, methodical way where they could prepare. They were able to patch those and move forward, but of course it was only a temporary patch. Now when John O'Reilly bought it, it was in a condition where it needed more work. So again, the original 1853 dam was about 110 feet wide. It had drainage pipes on the bottom, and then here, because we're going to talk about this more, was a spillway on the west side of the dam. That was critical. And again, if you look at Pymatooning, if you're standing on what is Carr Point, and you're looking across that little bit of water to the gatehouse, you have the dam this way, the gatehouse in front of you. If you look to your right, there's a little bridge, and there's a spillway. So, in fact, you don't see it very often, but here was it 2 weeks ago. If you went up to Pymatooning, the water was going over the spillway. That's how much rain we accumulate in this area, in western Pennsylvania. Because the Appalachian Mountains, they stop things. They catch things. When wind is coming up from the jet stream, they're catching that and stopping. It's almost like a wall. So this area gets a lot of different weather from that. But so that spillway was critical because the only way you could release water in a controlled sense was the spillway and those drainage pipes. And it's backing a lake that was the largest man-made lake in the country at the time. 2.5 miles long, almost a mile wide, and in some places 70 feet deep. So if we look at Pontotoning, you're looking about 3 times the size, but not quite as deep, but much more water. So this was a massive lake. And then the difference too is Pontotoning is not too much above level of going into Jamestown now. This was 400 feet above Johnstown. 400 feet, which is significant to what would happen as it went along. Because of these gentlemen right here. South Fork Hunting and Fishing Club. Andrew Carnegie over there. Henry Clay Frick, one of my least favorite people in history. Someone walked into his office and shot him one day in the belly, and he just got angry and he took it out on his workers. So Edward Ruff, he is who bought the dam off of John O'Reilly. He was the first president of the South Fork Hunting and Fishing Club. This would have been 1879, 1880. Here we have Elias Unger. Now, Elias Unger was in charge of hotels for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Again, Pennsylvania Railroad was tied to everything. They had their hands in everything, whether it was steel, hotels, shipping, any of it. They were a massive, massive company. Elias Unger, at least I believe, had a soul at the end of the day. And he will come into play later on in the story because he would be the president of the club at the time of the dam break. At the bottom, we have Robert Pitcairn, and then this is Andrew Mellon. So now again, between Pitcairn, Mellon, Carnegie, Frick, we're talking about the richest men in the world. These are the Zuckerbergs, the Bezos, the Musk of today. Railroad was the internet of the time. And so we had these guys who decided we need to get out of Pittsburgh because, again, the smog, the conditions. Pittsburgh was a dirty, dirty town in the overall physicalness of the town. And that was back then. We remember in Denora in the 50s where a cloud dropped on that city for 20 days? Killed 40-some people because no one could breathe. You walked outside at this time of day and it looked like it was midnight. So again, this is what they were creating. They were creating this industry that was filthy at the end of the day, but it was productive. It employed tens of thousands of people, immigrants mostly coming into the country. But of course the working conditions were terrible. Like people like Henry Clay Frick, who brought in the Pinkertons during the 1893 Homestead Steel Strike, which followed this event. So involved in this event, and then just several years later, he brings in a band of mercenaries onto the Monongahela River to kill steel workers who were looking for better wages, who were looking for better hours, who were looking to not have to work a 12-hour shift all week, and then you do what's called the quick turnaround, which was a 24-hour shift, and then go into your other shift, changed it from first to second. So, the conditions were ridiculous. You were a minimum of 6 days a week, and the pay was lucky to get you a tenement down Hazel Street, a tenement in Lower Hill, tenement up on the side of South Side Flats. So again, these guys had more money than they knew what to do with, which they earned. Do not get me wrong. They earned their money. Carnegie was intelligent. He was smart. He put his time in on the Pennsylvania Railroad before he seen that Bessemer steel and the Bessemer process could make him a fortune. Because he also seen the need, listen, track's going to need rail, which is steel. So he's seen the future. And that's what great visionaries do. They see the future. And that's, again, what he did. And then Frick, he made Coke. And that was what made steel. So let's not get that confused with anything else. But that's what made steel. And so he teamed up with Carnegie and these guys. Mellon helped finance it all. He was a big-time banker, became Secretary of the Treasury eventually. And they were able to share these industries, build these industries together, and of course build Pittsburgh. Wait there for a second. I just bought this new clicker. I think it was the greatest thing in the world. And it wasn't working for me. So what we have is the 1881 dam. South Fork Hunting and Fishing Club has now been put together, and they are up on the mountainside to build a club, a private club. Now, as more I was reading, it's like you didn't get a lot of perks with this club at the end of the day. You pay like $800 up front, which of course at that time would have been several $1,000s, and that gave you 2 weeks at a clubhouse. So that was it. So it was kind of, I believe it was maybe more of their idea of going to a camp. You know, this was kind of them going away from these glitzy, glamorous places to an area where they could just relax and fish and hunt and boat. And, but they could get a room for 2 weeks, and then you had to leave. Someone else was coming in. And when Carnegie and Frick and them guys went there, they did stay out the clubhouse. And I'll show you a picture of that here in a minute. But then a couple others built cottages. And again, a cottage at this is not what we're thinking of. Cottages were big, beautiful homes. But we have the 1881 dam. They bought this off John O'Reilly, Edward Ruff, and the South Fork Hunting and Fishing Club. They bought it off John O'Reilly. They lowballed him. You have the richest men in the world lowballing this guy for the possession of this dam. He was selling it for $2,500. They said, "No, we'll give you $2,000." He takes it because he can't do nothing with it anymore. He can't maintain it, not by himself. And more engineers are coming in to look at it, and they're saying, "Listen, you need this, 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 and this. This will become a major rehab project." He's like, "No, I want no parts. I'm getting out of this." So he sells that off for $2,000. Well, because he sells it off for $2,000, Ruff and Riley say, "Well, we'll have to scrap the drainage pipes, sell them off for scrap to make your money back." So they pulled the drainage pipes to sell them off for scrap. The most important part of the dam, they sell off for scrap. Now, because they pull those pipes at the bottom, the dam sinks, and it does one of these. And then instead of extending it and keeping it solid with the stone it had before, they don't. They just cover that with dirt. They cover that with loose gravel, some riprap, not the proper materials. And why did they use the proper materials? Because they didn't bring in any engineers. They had access to engineers, an endless list of engineers from out of Pittsburgh. They're like, "Nah, we'll be okay. We'll figure this out ourselves." So they brought in no engineers. And in turn, they didn't use the right materials. They didn't use the right size rocks. They didn't use the right size fill. They used loose gravel. They used loose materials that didn't hold like they were supposed to, because they wanted to do it up cheap. They wanted to just do it up cheap and focus on the clubs, the clubhouse, which they spent $2,000 on the dam, and then they spent $20,000 on the clubhouse, which of course at the time was a couple $1 million. So their priorities were here as opposed to here, while they still held back this huge amount of water. And engineers at the time, John Fulton from down Johnstown, came up and said, "Listen, this is no good. You got what's turning into 20,000 people living in the valley, and you got a dam that's no good. And you know the weather we get around here because of the way Johnstown sits in the middle of everything and next to the Appalachian Mountains." But they did not care. Instead, what they invested their money in was lowering the dam even more so that 2 carriages could fit across the top, because when you left the South Fork Railroad Junction to come into the club, you wanted to be able to stop on the dam and look out at the lake. Well, that's good. that's very nice. And so that's what they did. They lowered it so 2 carriages could cross. And then the second big thing they did was they took the spillway and they put an iron triangle here, if you can see that. They put this iron fence in there with fish screen, because they went to Lake Erie. They took 1,000 black bass, trophy fish out of Lake Erie. They loaded it on, again, this is what they're all paying for, a specialized train car that, as it was described in my reading, was like a giant aquarium. It was a giant aquarium that was on the railroad car, and they filled it with the fish, and they took that all the way from Erie to Johnstown. So again, you think of the cost involved in that, just to make that train car, because nothing ever been seen like that, but you had some of the best glass makers in the world as well. So they made this basically aquarium car to carry these prize fish. They put the fish in the water. The club says, we don't want the fish to escape, so let's block up that spillway. Let's get netting down there. Let's get everything we can, mesh, to keep those fish from escaping. So that's what they did. So here we have now the resurrected dam. They used hay and straw, hemlock pines, remains of the original dam and culvert, again, scrap pieces, runoff, and things like that, and then they extended the width. And then here was the South Fork Hunting and Fishing Club. They would come in, South Fork Trade Depot, and then they take their carriages from there, about 2 miles, up that road, across the dam, see the lake, and then you would go to the east, and then their cottages sat on the eastern side of the lake. And so that clubhouse, this is the modern clubhouse you see there today. And that actually is a little bit smaller than the original because there was another story on it, and there was a addition on the back. So it would have been probably twice the size of that at the time. It went originally from 15 or 16 rooms to 40. So that, again, it was a beautiful place, but kind of simple at the end of the day as well. Everyone who stayed there was required to eat in the dining room that was there. All the servants, all the cooks, of course, lived in Johnstown or surrounding communities, which we see here on the bottom. This is a good picture of the cottages going up Lake Conemaugh. And this is just a couple of them. Lippincott had one, Clark had one, Carnegie did not, Frick did not. They would, again, stay at the clubhouse. But several other big names. Horn was involved in the old department store that was down there. And so that is what they have built. And then here are some other pictures of the members. They would stay around the clubhouse. This is a Clark, not Clark candy bar. This was a steel magnet Clark, because most of these guys were steel guys. They were working in that industry. That's how they all knew each other, and that was the industry at the time. But he always wore a sailor's uniform for whatever reason. But if you see any pictures of him, he will be in a sailor getup. But they love to row and sailboats. You know, they reference it, sailboats on the mountain. You'd look up the mountain and you'd see these sails. And it just didn't look real because it looked like just a sailboat written on. Because you couldn't see the water, but you could see the sail. So it was a very, very hard thing to concept. And then the waterfalls. But at the same time, you see young people hanging out, is what it comes down to. Regardless of their wealth, they were just hanging out, just like we all did in the summertime. You know, fortunately, grew up in Pontooning. That's what we did. We'd climb down, go down to McConnell's Mills. Dara and I still go hiking McConnell's Mills all the time. Go check out waterfalls. You know, we just hang out. We'd fish. We'd get in a canoe. You know, go do that. So this was very young youth behavior who were just enjoying their summer as well. So I guess we do always have to keep that in mind, regardless of the wealth and the influence. They were still just young people trying to enjoy themselves. So here we have map of Johnstown. These were great maps sent to me by a ranger, Elizabeth Shope, down at National Park Service in Johnstown. And just a real quick note while I'm thinking of it, today in Johnstown, being the anniversary, they are doing several things down there. They're showing their phenomenal movie every 15 minutes. The National Park Service Visitor Center will be open till 10 p.m. And they also light 2,209 luminaries down where the old abutments of the dam were. When I went down there, I highly recommend the spot. I could only imagine it with those luminaries at night. I'm still trying to convince my wife to drive down there after this, but I don't think it's going to happen. But anyway, so yeah, highly recommend that spot. But this is, again, a map of Johnstown, and if we look, you have the two rivers. This is the Conemaugh. This was the one coming out of the dam. And then this was the Stony Creek. and then they meet to form the Conemaugh. So they called this the Little Conemaugh. And again, you have a confluence there, and everything was tucked. Picture Pittsburgh in a smaller version. Just everything tucked right on top of each other, right in this area. And ironworks here, here, further down. So you have those different spots. But what I zoomed in on was the area of Bedford and Main Street, because that is where the Hurlburt House was. Now the Hurlburt House, and if you see it, it's beautiful. Beautiful hotel down there. The Hurlburt House, at least at that time, is where Hugh and Florence DeFrance were staying. Or at least where Mrs. DeFrance was at the time. Whether they were living there or whether she was working there, I still am a little unsure of that, but that's where she was at the time of the flood. So the Hurlburt House, again, was a hotel, but it also had apartments. It also had people living there. And so that is where they were. That is our local tie, because the DeFrances, Hugh and Florence, were from Sandy Lake. They were both born out in that area. They were both born around Sandy Lake in the townships out there, and they moved to Johnstown. He was a druggist or a pharmacist. So he went down to Johnstown because of the boom. It was a boom town. And where else do you go when you have opportunities like that? So he goes down and takes that opportunity. And again, she was at the Hurlburt House at the time of the flood. Again, I don't know if she was staying there or if she had worked there, but there were several shops at the bottom. So you had commercial on the first floor, the rooms on the second floor. So she may have worked in one of those shops. I think there was a florist there. I think there was a clothing store there. So again, there's several different things that she could have been doing. And so we're going to talk about them a little bit more as the flood occurs. But the other map here shows Washington Street. Now, Washington Street was one of the worst damaged streets in Johnstown because it was right in the path. It was right in the path. You can see the river right here, the Conemaugh River. So now you can understand how wide that was, how big this swath was as it came down. But here on Washington Street is also where Victor Heiser lived. Now, Victor Heiser is an amazing story, and we'll get to that as we move along. But at the time of this part of the story right now, he was 16 years old. And Victor Heiser's parents, Matilda and George, they owned that's labeled as a grocery. Right there at 224, it says grow to a grocery store, but it was more than a grocery store. They were really bringing in some nice high-end products. So you had different levels of stores. Of course, at the time, guys, it just sold the main goods to those who would have been mining and steel working, and then you were able to have the stores that were selling a little better product, getting stuff in from different parts of the country, cities, and that for women, maybe more of society, dresses and things like that, high-end garments, textiles. And then in the back was 224 and a half. That is their barn that they had in the back where they kept their horses. Well, on the day of the flood, Victor Heiser was sent out to the barn to tend to the horses. So that's where he was when the flood came in. This is him here as a young man, and this is a shot of Washington Street. I couldn't tell you exactly which building was theirs, but this picture was taken, I believe, right around that block, right in that block, to show you again. But we see simple storefronts. You look at the square of Mercer; it's exactly what it looks like. You go down to Sharon, drive down downtown Sharon. This is what it was. This was the American Main Street, and it has been for centuries. So these are the people we have down in Johnstown, and along the way as well, and these smaller towns, which don't always get mentioned because, of course, of their size. And they seen death and they seen damage, but not, of course, to the level of this. We're talking about if we were all sitting in the bottom of a bowl and someone just filled that bowl up. I mean, it's going to have those end results. This gentleman here, John Park Jr., 22 years old. He just graduated University of Penn with a civil engineering degree. So one of the few civil engineers came back to this area, and he was put in charge of the sewer system. Because again, dams being ignored, no one's paying attention to the dam, but they are building a sewer system at the club for indoor plumbing. So John is in charge of this. And this at the time, well, in today's money, it would have been a $450,000 project to get sewer to this clubhouse and 16 cottages. So he's in charge of this. And as a young man, it's very impressive that he was able to come in, and he really had a commanding sense about it. And he was staying at the club while they were working on this, because a lot of members did not start coming into Memorial Day, just like we see now. Summer season starts Memorial Day. So that was very similar to this. So they're working on that project prior to it. There was just a few people there at the lodge and at the club. But what he did was he had mostly Italian immigrant laborers with him. That's who was helping him on this. So now we fast forward to May 30th. May 30th, 1889, the night before the tragedy, starts raining. It was actually a phenomenon, a weather phenomenon. There was a front that came out of California, moved across the country through Nebraska, through Kansas, caused torrential downpours in Nebraska, caused deadly tornadoes in Kansas, and it was moving across. There was also another front coming out of, I believe, the north. And so they basically met right inside that wall that was the Appalachian Mountains in Johnstown that night. The drizzle most of the day on the 30th, but then come about 11 o'clock at night, and we've all been there, you hear that storm come in, you just hear the rain pounding in big drops. It came down in buckets and buckets and buckets. And so Park knew something could be bad, because at the end of the day, you see it in the cover page, it said, "It will never happen to us." That was the thought process. The local joke in town, if you'd walk down, I'd see you on the street, I'd be like, "Hey, I wonder if the dam's going to break today." I'd be like, "Yep, it may." And then we laugh and we move on. That's how they've seen it. Victor Heiser compared it to being in the shadow of Vesuvius. Of course, the mountain that erupted in Pompeii. And they just learned to say, "Hey, it's right there. Could go at any time, but what are you going to do?" And so that's where they were. And they'd become disconnected in two reasons. One, it was way up there. And two, they trusted these people. They trusted Pitcairn. They trusted Carnegie. They think to themselves, and I would think the same thing. You got the richest men in the world who have every influence, who have every resource. Come on, they got to know better than me. I'm a lowly steel worker. I'm a lowly carpenter. They have to have that dam squared away. Why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they? But they didn't. But they didn't. So again, that became that situation. So as it begins raining, people do get concerned. Some people did leave. Some people just had a feeling. So they took off. This was a Friday that had happened. So this would have been a Thursday night. So you go into the weekend, they would have maybe tried to get out of town. Because again, there was trains coming through Johnstown from every direction all the time. You could catch a train in Johnstown at any point. Pennsylvania, Baltimore, and Ohio, any of them. So some people do say, "I'm going to get out of here, because even if it does flood a little bit, I'm not going to be around for it." But most people went about their daily routine. And in fact, the next morning was what they call Decoration Day. Of course, Memorial Day. The prequel to that, again, it was called Decoration Day, where citizens would go to the graves of mostly fallen Civil War soldiers. That was really where Decoration Day stemmed from, Memorial Day stemmed from, was the Civil War, which had just ended 25 years prior. So they would go there to decorate the graves and spend time, and there would be a parade. There was a big parade down in Johnstown, and even though it was pouring down rain and rain was starting to rise in the town, they still did their thing. They still celebrated that idea of remembering the dead and remembering the fallen. So that is where they were at on things. as this is happening, that same morning while the parade is going on, John Park is up at the dam. And Elias Unger comes down too, because he sees what's happening. He sees all the rain. They can hear the creeks just crashing into the lake, and they can watch the water rise. They say, I believe the water rised 8 inches every hour. That's significant. You're going to see that happen. And that's what they did see happen. So they took into action and said, what can we do? So Park took his Italian laborers down there. They dug a spillway on this side of the thing. Not much of a spillway, just enough to start moving a little bit of water. And then they realized that wasn't going to do anything for them. So they come back down. And at this point, they're running plows across the top of the dam, trying to dig up. But they only got a foot of loose dirt that, you look at it, it's like, oh, maybe that'll help. But it's not going to do anything at the end of the day. So they dig that up, and they're trying with the plows, and they're digging, and then the Italians go down to the bottom, and they start digging away at the spillway. Because what happened, of course, with all that mesh to protect those fish, logs, debris, everything, stacked up onto that. You can see it just a little bit here, the debris that surrounded all this. And at this point, the Italian laborers couldn't do anything about it. It's a lost cause. You're getting soaked. You are soaked to the bone. You're standing out in the water. You're trying to clear things until finally everyone was exhausted. John Park finally said, you know what? Hopefully we're good. And he goes up to eat lunch. Because at this point, he's thinking to himself, what else is there to do? I'm going to go up there. Probably said several prayers while he's eating, kept his fingers crossed, and just said, hopefully that's enough. Hopefully that'll be enough, and hopefully this rain stops. Well, the rain continued. And that was the result. Now, prior to this, they had the option to breach the dam slightly, which means they could go take a chunk out of the middle of it. Where that sag was, they could chunk it out and hopefully just slowly let that water out, kind of like what happened in 1862. And so it would be a slow ease, it would be like a slow bleed of water out, which would be damaging, but it would be, again, something Johnstown could at least prepare for, survive, etc. But nobody wanted to take the liability. They were waiting to hear from Pitcairn. Pitcairn was on a train heading east. At least when he heard about this, he headed east. And so let me go back one more step to John Park. John Park took off on his horse after he ate lunch. He took a horse down to South Fork and said, dam's in trouble. Dam's in trouble. Get that word out. Her name was Ehrenfeld, Miss Emma Ehrenfeld, dispatched to another gentleman who was very senior with the Pennsy, and they got word down to Johnstown. Dam is in bad shape. It's dangerous. It could go. Some people heeded the warning, others didn't, because again, it came from some local people. Now, if Pitcairn would have sent out a telegraph that said, hey, this is bad, people would have listened to Pitcairn. People would have heard that, and they would have moved on it. But because it was a local guy from Pennsylvania, and Emma Earhart, who was 23 years old, a lot of it was ignored. A lot of it was ignored. So, fortunately, though, John Park did make that ride. Some people compare it to like the Paul Revere ride, where it was like that very important ride of 2 miles he did in 10 minutes to at least let word out that something's happening, something is going to be bad today. But very few people heeded the warning. And with that, the dam collapsed. Eliza Unger, who was with Park and with the Italian immigrants trying to fix it, and he was the president of South Fork Club, he passed out. He just went into shock and fell on the ground. And when he seen it happen, because he knew. But again, nobody wanted that liability. Nobody wanted to take charge and say, hey, we can fix this, we can do this. So nobody did that, and instead, within a few minutes, this is what occurred. They said that water came over sounding like Niagara Falls. Fucking 20 million gallons just pouring out. And if we think of Niagara Falls, I'm sure, who's all been in Niagara Falls? So you guys are familiar. When you're standing there, you can hardly talk to the person next to you because it's such a roaring, heavy, loud noise. So with that, that's basically the only warning some people had, was they heard that noise. Very similar, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, to what was like a train noise prior to the tornadoes that happened on this day 40 years ago. You know, people said they heard like a train sound, and that was enough for warning. Get in the house, get in the basement, get in shelter. So this was similar. You only heard this noise. Out of this, now you've seen some people reacting. Now you had some of those guys that said, well, I got to do something. And as it came out of South Fork and it went down past South Fork, John Hess was his name. That's a picture of him there on the right. And this is a pictograph done. Of course, it probably wasn't as right there, but he gained hero status. Because John Hess and all these guys that drove locomotives, when they blew their whistle, you knew what time it was. John Hess came through that town every day, 3 o'clock. When he hit that whistle, everybody knew it was 3 o'clock. Everybody knew it was John Hess. Everybody knew the number on his locomotive. And him and other guys, that's how that operated. That's how important the train system was in Johnstown. Is again, the way it operated. Clockwork. But he comes through, he hears the flood first, gets a glimpse of it, and he ties his whistle down and goes blaring down the tracks down towards East Conemaugh from up near Mineral Point. Everybody hears this whistle. One, they know something ain't right. Something ain't stirring a cocoa at this point, because he never does this. This is out of the ordinary. That's what was so nice about those railroads, is it was also calculated. It was also status quo. This was not. This was something completely different. And he went blaring down those tracks, and he probably saved thousands of lives. That was a prediction, at least from what I had read and studied, saved thousands of people because of that simple act, which I think is awesome. Because one, I'm fascinated by railroads, and two, just that idea of a simple thing done by a simple man saved 1,000 lives, saved more than thousands of lives. So now the water is gushing down the mountain. And there are two towns, Mineral Point, South Fork. It didn't really hit South Fork too hard. I believe 2 people were killed in South Fork because of the way South Fork kind of sat. It was up on a hill a little bit. And so everyone was able to get up the hill and out of town. But now when it got to Mineral Point, and Mineral Point's an interesting place if you're down Johnstown, because it's just like houses sitting right on the water. There's just a row of them, and a couple other small places, and then the railroad tracks are on the other side. So this big viaduct that the Pennsylvania Railroad had built, and thousands of trains had crossed it, was now kind of in the way. Because once the water's over the dam, they said it snapped trees like straw. So now we're not seeing water anymore. Most people compared it to a blob. It was this monstrous serpent, blob, demon thing that was just doing this. Instead of gushing water, it was more like it was just moving towards it, but it was still moving at almost 40 miles an hour. But now it's picking up houses, it's taking roofs, it's taking trees, it's taking rocks, it's taking train cars, it's taking anything it can track, ripping it up, and now it's all become a part of the blob. And the mud, of course. So now it gets to the Conemaugh Viaduct and jams up there. Because of the big logs and everything like that, it ends up falling behind this. What do you think? That is a sound structure right there. That is an incredibly well-built structure by, again, some of the best engineers in the country. It gave, just split in half. And the water, they said at that point, because of how much it backed up, became a 75-foot high wall. 75 feet. So let's picture, if we look across the street at the Diamond, where the courthouse is. 2 of those wide and higher than the courthouse. That's what you're seeing. Picture that coming directly at you. People ran the best they could. People ran up the hillsides, behind trees, but there came a 75-foot wall and just crashed down and just took, again, everything in its path with it. This is a lithograph depicting the flood itself and just what it was doing at the time. Now, of course, well, from what I read, this is not an exaggeration. From what I have studied and read, this is not an exaggeration. Because again, it was just this level of chaos that no one had ever experienced before. It was this giant monster taking everything in its path, taking who it wanted. And so as it went further down, it took more and more people, more and more people. You've seen people riding on roofs. You've seen people, still in their houses. They were up on the 3rd floor in their house, kind of looking out the window as they're being carried down the hillside. I mean, you see, it was, I couldn't even imagine some of the description that I read. And what I do recommend, if there is one single volume, this is it right here. David McCullough's Johnstown Flood. David McCullough is one of my favorites. Absolutely, well, he's brilliant. Unfortunately, he's passing now, but this was David McCullough's first book. The reason he wrote this as his first book is because he was from Pittsburgh. So Johnstown was right down the road. So this became his first course of study. And if you have one single read, this is it right here. And David McCullough, I was fortunate enough, I always wanted to hear David McCullough speak in person. And I was at my daughter's graduation at Duquesne. She says, "Dad, there's someone here you might know talking today." I said, "Who?" She's like, "I'm not sure. You'll see." I said, "Okay." And out he came to get an honorary degree. He spoke for about 10 minutes. What a thrill, though, because he has that voice. He's the one who narrated Ken Burns' Civil War. And actually, if you get this on audiobook, he's the narrator as well. So it's very, very nice to listen to because he's just so good. But so he, in his descriptions too, I had to pause at times when I was reading because it's heavy. You have to take it in doses. Just say there's a Ken Burns, a documentary called The West. You have to watch it in doses. Because again, human nature can be as ugly as it gets. But in this case, again, this stemmed from a man-made disaster. So as I'm feeling resentment and anger and that towards the South Fork Hunting and Fishing Club, you also see people like John Hess, who really were amazing. And you see these different people that now come out of this tragedy as this happened. So, of course, the water floods down. It hits Woodvale. It hits East Conemaugh, where there was railroad stations. There was people from Philadelphia. There was people from Pittsburgh. There was people from all over the state and different parts of the country on a train. They're just trying to get to Philly. They're trying to get back to Philadelphia, and so they're parked in East Conemaugh, and this is what they see coming down the hill. So they didn't know what to do. A lot of them ran. A lot of the conductor said, "Now stay, we're okay, stay on the train, safest," which it may have been. But then you watch these train cars, and anyone, of course, who's familiar with a train car, you're talking about tons and tons and tons of weight, just lifted and throwing, like this chair here, just lifted and throwing. People behind them just crushed. So again, a lot of graphic tragedy, not to mention the drowning. But again, a lot of it was not drowning because this blob, it was more of a sucked under, suffocated type scenario, or hit with something, whether it was a tree, train car. Victor Heiser, who, when the flood hit his parents' store, he was in the barn, he climbed to the roof of the barn, and it took that roof, and it shot him down Washington Street, and it shot him on the top of this blob. Luckily, his father screamed out the window to him to let him know. He climbed onto the roof right as his father was killed, and his mother, both killed, right in front of him. And that was a lot of the tragedy. So many people watched others perish in some of the most tragic ways possible. Victor Heiser was one of them, because he rode that roof now for the next, I believe it was just over a mile. How long would it have been? About half mile? But it would have been up and down, and that to, he ended up hitting Prospect Hill, where the water kind of crashed, and again, we're dealing with a bull, so he hit that hill. But a lot of the debris, and that ended up right here on the Stone Bridge. Now, the Stone Bridge was a main railroad bridge for the Pennsylvania, right there, right past the confluence of the rivers. And so the water and the debris and the mud and the logs and the houses and all of it built up right there. Built up right there. There was also a 9-year-old girl named Gertrude Quinn who was in the 3rd floor of her house. Near this, she watched her aunt, her mom, and her sister washed away. She shot out the window on a mattress. Here's a 9-year-old girl on a mattress, riding this wave, riding this blob, until finally someone, I believe a steel worker, seen her, grabbed her up, threw her in a house, and then dove onto the mattress himself. So we had those situations. We had one guy who came down in the Beals. They were, he was a pastor, and they were on the 3rd floor of the rectory there, and a steel worker came by that was floating on a roof, and he jumped off that roof and jumped right into the 2nd window, or the 3rd story window, and that was the first time they really realized that the flood was right there in front of them, was this gentleman jumped into their house. And you've seen a lot of that. You've seen a lot of people run into houses because he already had over a dozen, almost 20 people in there kind of for safety. It became a safe house. Some of these big stone churches could do that, obviously, because they had a little more, obviously, girth to them. But everything, the majority, ended up crashing onto the stone bridge and building this pile that some people said was between 30 and 60 acres. 30 and 60 acres of just debris in this big, big pile. And there was still hundreds and hundreds of people caught in this debris. Well, what had happened is because, diesel fuel was everywhere from these trains. The kerosene that these houses lit their lights with. All these combustible liquids were now sitting on everything. Something sparked. Still uncertain how that happened. Something sparked. And we've seen a massive fire start as well. So now, if you weren't drowning, suffocating, you were burning. And again, I don't want to get too graphic in the nature of things, but that was one of the hardest things for people to endure, watching that, because there was nothing they could do about it. Nothing they could do. Now, firefighters were coming out from Pittsburgh as quick as they could, different people like that. But again, this was all so right now. This was all in real time. So it really left just an awful smell and just this awful situation. Now, at the end of it, they did say that I think the fire burned for just shy of 3 days. Once they did put it out, they did say only 80 bodies were actually burned in the fire, which is a blessing, I guess, at the end of the day, instead of what could have been the situation. But that was another tragic part of it. So even when the flood ended, there was this that had to be dealt with. So now we look at the aftermath. And some of these pictures, again, it's just amazing. We have telegraph lines, we have the different buildings all on the street. And again, we just look at the accumulation of debris, the accumulation of all these different things that were destroyed. Again, here's a railroad, here's a train that was just, washed right off the tracks. And tragic. And here again, this is John Hess with his crew afterwards, standing next to the destroyed locomotive, because he eventually jumped out, ran his whistle as long as he could, jumped out, locomotive was taken. So he got a picture with his crew. And but again, you see how much, the railroads were key. Railroads are absolutely the key, and the different houses and the destruction that came along with it. That's again, the area, the country, nobody was ready for. Nobody was ready for. This was the Hurlburt house, we remember. This is where the DeFrances were staying. Unfortunately, Florence DeFrance did die in the flood. Her husband came back to Sandy Lake, remarried, but she did die in the flood. And this is a before picture, and this is an after picture. Wow. Obviously, you can see in the after picture there was nothing left. There was nothing there. So how she survived? Well, again, I should say, how could she have survived at that situation? This is a famous picture that came out. It's called the Schultz House. Schultz House was taken, the picture was taken because, of course, a tree went right through it, and that house rode down the blob with that tree in it. When it landed, that's how it looked. So people would climb out onto the tree to get their pictures taken and things like that. The Schultzes lived, which is a miracle, because you can imagine one of these gigantic maple trees coming right through the front window and into the house. But it fortunately, I believe the entire family survived. But that is the thing. 99 entire families perished. 99 entire families perished. I guess if I was there, I guess that would be the way to go if you're going to go with your whole family. But at the same time, you did have so many orphans. You had 375 children die in the flood, 99 entire families. The total number they put on it was 2,209. That's kind of the agreed upon number of dead. There was 777 unidentified. Because again, there were so many people that had come into town to work, people you didn't know, people that were burned. And then of course the decomposition, because when someone is buried under that much mud, and it takes 5, 6, 7 days to get to them, there's going to be nothing left. In fact, there was one body that they refused to show the family because it was like, you don't want to see it. You don't want to be part of that. Now, Gertrude Quinn, the little girl I was telling you about, the 9-year-old who was saved, she ended up on Prospect Hill at someone's house. Someone she did not know. Someone took her in. A lot of people took people in, especially up on Prospect Hill, which is, I believe that would be the eastern hill of Johnstown. Southwestern, I'm sorry, hill of Johnstown. And so many people were taken in, and she was. And then the rumor got down to her father, who had survived as well. And so they were able to be reunited shortly after that. That was one of the great scenes that people would write about that came out of that, when the little girl was reunited with her father. But again, you had people who were just lost, just hiding. A lot of women, a lot of men too, but they were stripped naked. So women would hide for days in the woods out of modesty and embarrassment. And so they weren't found, so they were pursued then. And finally, as people started going in and getting help and that, then that could be happening. But you've seen a lot of that. 80-year-old woman in a tree, just hanging there, barely her nightgown on. And so she just kind of didn't want to get out of the tree. And of course, after what she'd seen, why would she at that point? There was one soldier, when the army eventually comes in, who did kill himself because he's seen too much. He just was overwhelmed. He was a young fellow too, and he just was overwhelmed with it, and probably started having nightmares. But it led to that scenario as well. But this right here, Clara Barton. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Clara Barton. Clara Barton was a bright point of this story. She was 60-some years old. She was 5 foot tall. She had made her reputation on the battlefields of the Civil War. Antietam especially was a big one. Fredericksburg and that, where she came in and nursed people in her 20s, late 20s and her 30s. And she became a very famous nurse during the Civil War. So out of that, she had gained fame. She had got to know the right people, and she stuck with this occupation, this aptitude there, and she became the first director of the Red Cross, which of course we know is very much first on the scene in any of these tragedies. Well, the Johnstown Flood was their first big disaster. It was their first big gig, if you want to call it that. So she came in. Now the Army had been dispatched under Hastings, Pennsylvania National Guard, and different ones, and they had come in, so they were kind of in charge. Well, they were in charge until she got there. And this little 5-foot woman said, nope, this is my spot now. And everybody, every soldier, every command, every man that was there, because thousands and thousands of men had come in to help reconstruct. They had come in to help, dig out. They'd come and help rebuild. So you had thousands and thousands of men, which of course you had problems with that from these different camps. You got into the drunkenness. There was a ban on alcohol for like the first month and a half, but when that was lifted, it is what it is. Guys got to it. And so you had some of those issues that went from it. But they also rebuilt stuff incredibly fast. They rebuilt the Conemaugh Viaduct out of wood within a couple weeks, so that trains could get across, because they needed the trains to bring in the supplies. Pittsburgh sent trains on the daily. One train came out, every single car was filled with coffins. Every single car was filled with coffins. So, in fact, there was a shortage of coffins basically in western Pennsylvania, northeast Ohio, because they couldn't keep up with it. And then some people, of course, were so disturbed by the coffins that were this big. So, with that, Clara Barton comes in, takes charge. She brings 50 doctors with her from the DC area, and they get to work. They set up a tent city. I don't know if you can see that as well there on the last picture, but right off the tracks, they started setting up tents and setting up areas, and she started to conduct the orchestra. And she did a phenomenal job. Phenomenal. She was there for 5 months. They were there for 5 months. Now, the nice thing was, and what is still amazing about this country, is people come together. People collected money. Pittsburgh put $500,000 together, sent it out. And this was money at that time, 500 grand. I mean, New York sent money, Philly sent money. All these different organizations, elementary schools, they throw their little pennies together and dimes and send it. They raised like $33 million, I believe, give or take, at that time for the relief effort. People sent everything, even stuff that they couldn't really use at the time, but they just wanted to send things to help. And so you had train fulls of supplies and food, and that food distribution became part of the problem as well. Someone said all the pretty girls got more food than the rest of them. Well, I guess it depends on who's handing it out. But just little things like that. But at the same time, they had the food, they had the supplies, they had the resources. So it's now an opportunity to rebuild and to work together and try to identify. But unfortunately, there was bodies found as far away as Cincinnati years later. So a lot of bodies showed up in Pittsburgh because the rivers flowed into the Allegheny eventually. It was a tributary system. So the water flows into the Allegheny, and then and they end up guys down on the point, all the way from Johnstown. Now, our buddy Victor Heiser here, I think it's really interesting with him because, again, we talk about ripple effect. We talk about impact, influence, things like that. Victor Heiser was 16 years old when he rode that roof down into the valley from his parents' stores. He watched his parents get washed away. Well, Victor decided to leave Johnstown, and he went on to become a doctor. And he went on to go to the Philippines and other Southeast Asian countries, and he became a famous physician, and he brought public health to the rest of the world. Again, we talk about infrastructure. America's health system was improving by the day. You didn't see that in other parts of the world. He took it there. He built an infrastructure, a health infrastructure in these parts of the world. Became very famous. Wrote books that other doctors read. And the American Doctor's Odyssey and these different things that made him very famous. So when he came back into Johnstown, he was very well recognized. But he said, if my parents wouldn't have been killed in the flood, I would stay in Johnstown and ran the store. That was his plan. 16 years old, he's like, I take over from my dad when he's ready to call it quits. I run the store. That was that. That was going to be my life. But because of this unforeseen tragedy, because of this epic event, he was able to go and he became one of the most famous people in the world and did some amazing work. So I always thought that was very fascinating. We're going to shift gears just real quick before we wrap up here to another anniversary, because again, this is the 136th of the Johnstown Flood, but this is also the 40th anniversary of the tornadoes that came through here on May 31st, 1985. I'm sure a lot of you remember those. may have had struggles and sufferings in that, may have lost. I was 5 years old, getting ready to turn 6 years old, but it was one of my earliest memories. And I remember we were outside with Scott, Jeff, and Norman, with my cousins, and we're collecting hail balls, because the hail balls were like the size of baseballs. We'd never seen anything like it before. It was crazy. And so we're out there collecting them. We're putting them in the freezer, but we had no electricity, which we didn't take into account at the time. We're like, hey, let's get these in there. So we did. But at the same time, I remember my mom hollering over. She was over at my grandparents, who were next door. She hollers over to us. We head for the basement. We're down in the basement, and then the tornado hits. So we were in the basement. So we had, we knew it was dark. I remember that sky being so dark. But the only other things I remember of it was my aunt and uncle's store, my dad's sister, their store, the roof got blown off of it. It was right down the hill from us. So the tornado had come across near Jamestown. It had taken the roof off of what was called Richter's Grocery of the time, and then it turned. It was supposed to be coming up the hill right towards our house, and for whatever reason, it turned. And then I believe it headed out towards Atlantic and that. Mm-hmm. And that, now some of these pictures are from Albion, Niles, Atlantic, so it is all very local. And if you look on these maps, it is, the lines of the tornadoes went through Lawrence, right through Mercer. This is the one that came up through Atlantic and Jamestown, up into Crawford, up into Erie. Albion was damn near destroyed because of it. But with that, we drove out to Atlantic. It would have been the next day, maybe the day after, shortly after though. And this is my other memory that sticks in my head. But we drove out to Atlantic, and I remember seeing a cow wrapped around a tree. And I'll never forget it. Of course, this is part of my counseling right here, so thank you. I could talk about this. But it was just, again, something I'd never seen, something I never pictured I'd ever see. And just what this damage did, not to mention just that there was no houses left. There's just no houses. You see these foundations and piles of rubble, and that was it. That was it. And it's like, how could this happen? But it did. It did. So again, you see, and so I guess why I'm bringing this up too is not only something we can remember on this day, but also the comparison of tragedy is tragedy. Regardless of the timeline, again, this is the thing we always have to remember about history. It's always relevant. We'll always have weather. They've had weather since the beginning of time. That can affect things. And then different, again, engineering when it comes to that. I mean, these different tragedies that we see where it's based on, did we do it right? Did we build it? So whether it's man-made or natural, it's still destruction. It still affects people's lives. It still impacts. So again, you have the cover of the Herald here, and then you have the cover of the, the Johnstown Press, I believe. And you have two pictures that are similar, very, very similar. And so what I did was, on the right, you'll see an 1889 picture, and then I took the pictures from 85, antiqued them a little bit, and set them next to each other. And you can see how similar they are. Again, you have these houses that have been destroyed. And it doesn't matter if it was an 85 or if it was an 89. And that was the thing, you'll see cars destroyed in 85. Back then, horses. That was another issue. They had to burn thousands of dead animals because that was the easiest way to do it. So again, you talk about smells. I talked about it in the aftermath at Gettysburg when I did my presentation on Gettysburg. The smells. And that's what you see here, the flies, the biblical level of flies and mosquitoes and different things like that, and how they affect your day-to-day living. In Gettysburg, they couldn't open their windows, but you're talking August. So it's like windows are closed in August. You're dying inside your house, but you can't open them because you can't take that smell. And so you've seen a lot of that same thing in Johnstown. And with the aftermath of Johnstown too, you had, just like with Gettysburg, 50,000 people came into Gettysburg, tens of thousands of people came into Johnstown. Some of them there to help, some of them there to work, some of them there to steal, some of them there to scam, some of them there to take advantage, some of them there to do those different things. So, you know, you always have that, just like in Gettysburg, very similar. And I'm sure in 1985 there were similarities there as well. You know, you had guys that come in, said they would do work and bounce after they get paid, things like that. So it's one of those things. So again, you see the damage, and I'm sure there's a picture out there somewhere of someone from Johnstown grabbing up their little dog and walking out of the flood scene. I believe this is I want to say this is Atlantic right here, that or it's Albion, one of the two, and then of course Johnstown on the other side. But again, you look from like an aerial view, and you see destruction. You see just a swath of destruction. And I remember when I was fixing up my house, I bought an old house, and there was a lot of work to do. And I remember just sitting there one day so overwhelmed as to what do I do next? So I couldn't even imagine coming upon this as a contractor, as a family man, as someone who owned a home, and just the overwhelm. This is the point where you just kind of sit down in the street and you bawl your eyes out for a little bit, and then you stand back up and say, okay. But yeah, it's amazing. Again, and just the similarities of tragedy, and but again, people coming together, because we know in '85 we watched it. You were probably very much a part of it in the rebuilding of an area. You drive out through Atlantic now; it's beautiful, and it was just a year or so after this. You know, 1986, Atlantic was back to being a beautiful place. Albion was back to being fully functional. So people rebuild. And with that thought process, I thank you very much for your attention.